Support for this episode comes from the University of San Francisco's SWIG program in Jewish Studies and Social Justice, better known as JSSJ. The new JSSJ graduate level certificate program in JEDI, Justice, Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion, equips professionals with invaluable skills, tools, and resources that organizations need to bridge generational gaps and ensure inclusive growth. Learn from renowned experts like Julia Watts-Belzer in her upcoming course, Disability and Jewish Social Justice. Apply for her class by May 15th. Go to usfca.edu/JEDI. That's usfca.edu/JEDI. This is Judaism Unbound, episode 425, Passover 2024.
Welcome back, everyone. I'm Dan Liebenson.
I'm Lex Rofberg.
And I'm Miriam Champ.
And we're all together again. We got the band back together. Last month, we were talking about Purim, and this is our kind of new little format where we're talking about holidays. And today, because Passover's coming up, we thought we would talk about Passover. So, Miriam, you want to get us started? Like, what are your big ideas about Passover 2024?
Also, what's Passover?
No biggie, super easy. So we're telling the story of being redeemed from Egypt, finding our way through wilderness, eventually in some journey towards promised land. And we do this often with a Seder, with a communal meal of some kind, that we are supposed to experience as if we ourselves have been redeemed from Egypt, bondage. And we eat according to certain rules of abstention, and we're supposed to sort of live back into this story. A classic fun fact is that of all the Jewish holidays, this is the one that is most celebrated. And I think there's lots of reasons for that. Big ideas. For me, Passover is something that I've wanted to reclaim, that it wasn't something I was leading for anyone else, but something that could be manifested directly in my own family experience. And I like to think about it as when my children have grown up, what is the story of our Jewish life? And they'll say something like, oh my gosh, when I was a kid, or when I was growing up, or when I was a teenager, my family would have these amazing Passover celebrations, and everyone was included, and we'd learn something, and we would sing, and we would eat. And so for me, actually, there is no Haggadah, there's no book that we walk through, but there's a piece of the story we choose to manifest in that given moment. And I was raised where my parents would go down to the shelters and bring people who are identified as Jewish from the shelters into our home, which was beautiful and also complicated, because then they would like drive them back to the shelters with like these huge big baggies of food. And it was sort of like, for that moment, it was a beautiful symbol, but not necessarily enduring. In my place, I take seriously the adage that there should be a seat for every person. And so I have mine in my backyard, rain or shine, and about 75 people come. I don't really care about the food, and I don't really care if we all sort of know the same parts of the story, but we're all sort of working in some element towards liberation.
That's incredibly cool. And I really love Passover. And I think because it's the most observed Jewish holiday, like, we miss that it's the holiday that Jews observe a little bit most, if that makes sense. And I'm not saying that to be an asshole. It's just like, I love Passover. I've had an experience with Passover just about every year of my life that I have found deeply meaningful. And for me, it's mostly centered in the experience of Seder, in the experience of gathering a bunch of people, or being gathered by others as part of a group of people to share this ritualized meal. I've been to all sorts of different kinds of Seders, and I think like it's a ritual where even a not great Seder tends to be pretty meaningful in the grand scheme. I think like a not great Rosh Hashanah service is something that I might feel like very little at all. But even like a run-of-the-mill Passover Seder that does things pretty traditionally and pretty by the book, I find to be like, oh, okay, so we like shared a story and like thought a little bit about justice. The groundwork is there. But when it's not Seder, the rest of the holiday is like, yeah, I have eating things that I do. So I do like the weirdness of like eating this crackery matzah thing every day. I make sure to eat matzah every day of Passover. Like, it's more important for me to do that than to really sweat exactly what surfaces my food might have touched and whether there's possibly a micro amount of leavening or whatever. So the positive thing of eating matzah resonates for me because it's like a reminder and it's weird. And I like things that push me out of my normal ritually. But like, I've asked this on the show in the past, and I continue to struggle to figure out like what my rhythm is. outside of Seder. And when I say this to people, they're often like, well, it sounds like you shouldn't just have a Seder on the first night, Lex. You should do it later in the holiday so that you have like a reinfusion. And that's like fine, but it's kind of a dodge because like I don't really think that having multiple of the same, like having multiple Seders is like the answer. I feel like we need to find a flow where there would be something more meaningful throughout the other, for me, 6 days in addition to the night I have the Seder, which is 1 day. So that's not an answer. It's like a question, but that's what I'm sitting with this Passover.
I think like a lot of times I have some radical idea and people are like, oh, it's not really a good idea because, you know, people really like it the old way. And I'm thinking the first Seder night, realistically, lots of people want to do that. And like you say, it's this holiday that the largest number of people want to do something. That's great. And that should be affirmed. I'm actually thinking now that maybe there's room for the second Seder to be something really special. And I've had other ideas in the past about having the second Seder on the last night of Passover, but here I'm really talking about
gotta be a gap.
Yeah, but here I'm really talking about the possibility of a second night on the second night. Because what I'm thinking about is I more and more am getting a sense sometimes that it's not for everybody to run ahead of the pack and scout out some new version of Judaism. Like a lot of people are like, there are too many things of the old version that I want to hold on to. And that's kind of not really where I want to spend my time. And there are all kinds of reasons why all of the adventurous reimagining stuff that we're talking about isn't for everybody. And the way that I'm thinking about this in the story of Passover is that maybe there were certain people that stayed back in Egypt. Because they were all the Israelites there in the wilderness. They're always complaining, like we had to leave the flesh pots of Egypt and everything to come to this wilderness where there's no water. And we're taught to read that as like, oh, those complainers, you know, they really were slaves in Egypt and they are now not slaves. And why are they not grateful that they're not slaves? But part of me is like, actually, the wilderness really sucks. I hate it. I don't like camping. And I think that if I were in the wilderness, I would probably have nostalgia for things that even are kind of bad back in the city. And so like, I understand those people. And part of me feels like on the first Seder, that's for all the Jews. I mean, think of the first Seders happening in Egypt. Like that's where we all get together. We think about this story. We talk about possibilities. But the truth is that most of the people at the Seder with us aren't really going to want to come along on that camping trip in the wilderness. And I almost am wondering, what would it look like if we had a second Seder or a second kind of gathering, and it's only for the people who opt in? And it's not instead of, it's in addition to. And so if you don't want to come, that's totally cool. You don't have to. What would we do on that second Seder that was different from what we generally do on the first Seder? And I'm wondering if that's a frame that maybe helps us think creatively about possibilities that we might not otherwise see.
I think that's already happening, Jan. One of the ways, I think, Lex, you're right about we all do something, or many of us do something rather than it's nothing. But that something, I think, is free of some of the bonds of what we have to do because we're able to shorten it, or we watch clips of videos or all kinds of different things that we're trying to infuse the current practice with that. I think it could also work that, I mean, you have to do something with all those leftovers, that the feast just keeps changing and you have to reinvent it as you go along. But I do think that there's a mixed multitude in the wilderness who might not like camping. I'm probably in that camp with you, and might still yearn for the food or whatever's happening back in Egypt, but are also trying to navigate this part of the journey. I think a lot about that first realization in this Exodus story where they get through the seas and there's been this miracle and they've been redeemed, and they start complaining at that point about meat, and Moses gets so upset. And I think that's about reconciling the fact that when we finally get what we want, when we finally get to liberation, it's really uncomfortable and it's not easy, and that we don't really negotiate that piece of the Passover Seder. We're like striving for comfort and food and abundance and all those like beautiful elements of liberation, but not really talking about the parts that suck. We skip the whole golden calf. We skip the things that we do with the spoils of Egypt. And I'm wondering maybe one way we could be doing this over the course of the 7 or 8 days that one might practice Passover is to take each stage of the journey and figure out what the treasure is or a message is for our moment. I've been thinking about this with my friends about the golden calf as the very first ritual that the Israelites do after they have been liberated. We're told it's a bad ritual. Like, what did you do? But maybe it was a way of reconciling all their ill-gotten gains. Maybe it was a way of creating something that was an echo of something else and therefore imperfect. Like, I kind of like that idea that we could just be visiting different elements.
Matzah calves. That's what I'm hearing.
Matzah calves?
Matzah calves, or calves.
Like gingerbread houses out of matzah?
Golden matzah calves. So, okay, no, but like, that's one stage of it, right? Like, I'm picturing, I like what you said about experiencing the different stages of the journey. And I'm interested in like doing a thing related to that story. So, like I said, I think eating matzah every day is a great thing to do to help the holiday feel like it's continuing and not like, to me, it's better to like eat a little bit of matzah and break all the rules. Like, let's say somebody ate like ham and bread for all of their meals during Passover, but they had matzah every day. I actually think that there's something about that I would like, because they're making sure to have matzah every day, as opposed to somebody who like keeps all the rules of not having bread, but they don't have matzah. But so like, let's say we're having matzah every day and I want to do like matzah statues. I've done this in some Sunday school classrooms for different things, like using matzah and other food materials to make fun little things. I like playing with my food. I think we get to do it a little bit in the Seder with like the Hillel sandwich. You're making kind of a off the beaten path sandwich. I want to do that for like, okay, receiving the 10 commandments. Let's make like matzah tablets, matzah mountain, then matzah calves. I like the golden calf. Shouts to our episode with Amichai Lalavi from way back when, where he said that if he were there, he would have donated and danced around the calf. I think that having tactile connections to the post-Egypt stages of that story would be really cool. And so then we have to figure out what those 6 are, because we have one that's sort of captured by the Seder, and then we need 6 more. So maybe we get to maybe some of that complaining, that like maybe we like air our grievances, Seinfeld Festivus style, on day 4. Like you air all the things that are tough about Passover, but then we're back and they're like, oh my gosh, like we might get to this new land and like you embody the 12 spies story. I don't know. Korach getting swallowed up by the ground. Maybe we do like matzah outside and dig a hole. I'm ready for this stage of the Passover experience.
I like that idea that you could pick one thing. I think that it's important to identify what the why is. Like, when we talk about matzah, I mean, okay, is the bread of affliction? Is it really what was on people's backs? Or is it this idea that we're abstaining from something that puffs up in our life, that swells us? And what else could we be abstaining from or bringing more into our lives that would work? I always remember I was in 6th grade and I was in a girls' bathroom and we were talking about Passover and Lent. And my friend was sitting there, brushing her hair and just like being, kind of girly. And she said, well, for Lent, I'm giving up gossip. And I remember even at that stage thinking how powerful it was to be giving up a characteristic that she wasn't proud of in a context that was almost impossible to be a middle school girl in that context, to say, actually, I'm going to try to be a better human, and that's the rule of the holiday. And it stuck with me all of these years, that what could we be adding to our lives and what maybe has puffed up in our lives that needs reduction. Now, that's not the same as playing with your food. And I'm sure I just made it Debbie Downer right now, but I think that there's something there of like, what character, and I think it sets us up for the Omer. Like, who do I want to be? And how does the story help me become that person? And then what are the tangible, fun things that activate that in me?
But can we get even deeper into this question of the why, right? Because you just alluded, for example, to kind of a midrash, right? A kind of an interpretation that some people have about Passover, right? They say that leavened bread is puffed up, like we can be puffed up. And matzah is a flattened bread, like we should flatten that part of us that can get puffed up. And that strikes me as like, that's one way that we can understand the why of Passover. Now, there's also, of course, the more obvious one that we were slaves and then we're freed. And what does that call upon us to do? So I'm curious about like, when we think about why we even have this holiday of Passover, and I'm not asking only a descriptive question. I mean, I'm not asking a historical question. Why was it invented? That could be a relevant thing to ask. But what is it that we're trying to make happen on this holiday? And that's the part that, for me, there's then a 2-step question, right? There's, what are we trying to make happen? And then there's the question of like, theoretically, how could that happen? And then there's the question of practically, how does that happen? And I sort of wonder whether we kind of are stuck in our Jewish practice, not just of Passover, but in general, by not necessarily having resolved all three of those questions. Like sometimes even we're proud of ourselves because we've got 2 out of 3, but I'm not sure 2 out of 3 works. And I'm not saying that every person has to have all three worked out, but hopefully the person who is like designing the ritual that the other people are designing, the practice or the experience or whatever you want to call it, whether that's a Seder or just the way that we spend the week, hopefully the person who's making those decisions. So in a family, it might be the parents, or for a Seder, it might be whoever's hosting the Seder, that person has kind of thought through those 3 questions. And just as an example, like I find the Passover Seder at best, people might, who are organizing a Seder, in the best of circumstances, they might say, oh, I know what Passover really is about for me. It's about freedom, and it's about the responsibilities of freedom. And then they say, and I really think that we should talk about that. We should mention it. And they do. But somehow it doesn't hit anybody in the Seder really that hard because the practice didn't quite get it. Like the practice, it's just not strong enough. And so people walk out saying, that was an interesting conversation, and then kind of forget about it. Like it just doesn't change them. And I'm wondering what it would look like if I came to a Seder or I came to any Passover thing or any other holiday, and I walked out of that experience saying, I am changed. And I know that's a lot of pressure to put on something, but before we dispense with it, I just want to like, what would that even look like? Do we know of anyone who's done something like that? Or like, what would it be like for Passover?
Well, so I think that's an amazing question. And for me, of necessity, the answer to that is that I would have soaked into something for more than one evening. I think you can have an amazing Seder. Like I do. I believe I go to the best Passover Seder in the universe every year. It's at my mom's. We co-created. She set I'm not like taking credit. She set the rhythms of what is amazing about it, and I sort of execute them and add to them. To me, the answer to your question of like, how would Passover change us is if it were not just like a couple hours of real experience. And so that's why for me, I'm not just saying like play with your food the rest of Passover because it's cool. I mean, I do think that's part of it. But this gets at like a bigger difference that I know you and Dan have. I don't have as good a sense of this with Miriam. But like over the years, we talk about a lot of holidays and rituals, and I often don't start with why. Actively. Like I don't believe in starting with like, what's the purpose? I find prescribed whys ritually to be unbelievably disengaged, like disempowering and uninteresting. My least favorite part of the Seder is when we hold up the Seder plate and say, this is the salt water. It stands for our tears in Egypt. This is the charoset. It's the mortar for the bricks. This is the bit, like, it'd be much more fun if we had, here's salt water. Yo, table, what do you think this salt water stands for in our story? That would be generative. That would be interesting. And by the way, here's one example, maybe the tears, so that you have a sense of the kind of answers we're looking for. But like, what might this mean? To me, playing with the food, it wouldn't just be like nothing, but it would allow for people to come up with the generative whys. And I think that's what we end up doing anyway. Like you can tell somebody Sukkot has booths outside because we want to commemorate impermanence and wandering in the wilderness all you want. A lot of people's connection to Sukkot is, I like hanging out with friends outside for 7 days. And I actually don't think that's bad, that they lack a tie to like the ancient story. I think that that's a powerful intention to have. And I think that when you do that, I believe in people's ability to channel that seemingly low-key intention into bigger ideas, into, oh, I'm making cute little tablets, and then I'm breaking them because Moses breaks them. I'm actually thinking about this story, and isn't it interesting that the first commandments we ever received from God, we break them in front of the entire people?
I imagine that all three of us don't like prescribed answers or whys, or even ones that aren't specific to our needs. And so I think like saying that we have this idea in Judaism that we're supposed to imagine a time where we journeyed from one place of constriction to a place of freedom, and that it's a story that plays out individually and collectively every year, or hopefully over the course of many years, that we are constantly in a place of transformation. And guess what? There is no promised land. That's something that we're developing and getting closer to. If the why is, if you're talking about Sukkot, to be amongst people, I think that's fine. And I think that I've been in many seders where they say, what does it stand for? What does it work? We ask all the kids and the kids come up with a million answers. That's actually a beautiful thing too. I agree with it. I think too that when Dan, you said, what would it take to be changed by something is a goal of yours. And maybe a goal of somebody else's might be, I want to walk into this holiday and believe that I'm connected to a larger group of people, to a multitude. For me, Passover has become this one holiday or one time in my year. And it does take several days, Lex, because I can't fit all the invites, especially when it rains and they clog up all the bathrooms and like all the different things that happen with having too many people in your home. What would it mean to believe that I could be radically welcoming and that maybe the rules don't matter? And if I ask people to bring a potluck that is Passover sensitive and someone brings Triscuits or whole wheat bread instead of what's normally prescribed, to actually see that it's an act of beauty. But maybe I have paper plates and I don't need to put it on mine. But I think figuring out why it's meaningful and what you want from it then leads to those practices, if that makes sense.
I think the thing that I'm trying to say, number one, is you should have goals. I think it's good to have goals for a ritual, for a practice. I agree that it's not the best pedagogy to hold up a thing of salt water and say, these are the tears of the Egyptians. I mean, these are the tears of the Israelites. And that's just
you
not...
You just did it. It's the tears of the Egyptians.
Yeah, okay, so we already did. We're doing live interpretation right here. That's not the best pedagogy, but one thing that one could do in the world, in life, right, is just say, hey, we're just going to go around and hold up 10 random objects and then ask the people around the table, what does this mean to you? What does this draw out of you? And that would actually be an amazing conversation, I'm sure. I think that what I'm trying to do at Passover, and I think with other Jewish practices, is say, if I'm going to be the person leading this experience, then I am going to think in advance about what the goals are that I have for people in this experience. And then the responsibility is on me to figure out how to create an experience that delivers on the goals that I have. For me, yes, I am looking for experiences that change me and that change those who attend, because I think that we all need changing.
Jews are like diapers. We all need changing.
Yeah, because none of us is leading the life that we really yearn to live. And that if we had experiences that said, I've come out of this experience a little bit better able to live the life that I've yearned to live, I think that would be a good thing. That's my aspiration. And I guess there is a possibility of achieving that through conversation, but I think that conversation would be with a subset of the people that usually gather at any of our seders. I think that's partly why I'm attracted to this idea of the second seder that has a smaller group of invitees, that are really the people who maybe through conversation we could get somewhere. I think that I'm not that good at designing rituals. Like, I wish that I was a playwright. I wish that I was a singer-songwriter, because I imagine that some of those are the mechanisms that we use to give people an experiential journey. And unfortunately, all I know how to do is have a conversation. So I think that's part of why I find yearning for somebody who is going to create this powerful, powerful experience that I don't know how to create. And that's why I think I tend to feel kind of stuck when we're talking about ritual development. I feel like when I've been at experiences that other people have created, they're not creating it with my goals in mind. So I'm trying to figure out partly like my solution to that.
Yeah, well, it's funny. I feel like, and I don't know who goes to your Seder. Like, I feel like there's somebody who goes to your Seder, and maybe this is just my trust of the universe. Like, I think there's somebody who goes to your Seder that might think of themselves as a person who's good at creatively developing practices or rituals. That same person might feel like they don't know very much or all the ins and outs of the Passover story. And I feel like part of what you're pointing to is the need to not have Seders and other rituals centered on like one leader, but rather horizontalize the process. And so and I've tried to do this for years. I've said to my mom, like every year, the past bunch of years, we should have a potluck, but not in the food sense where everybody brings food, but rather in the Seder sense where there's, the 14 traditional sections of the Seder and we like potluck it and everybody preps one section. And we've never done it because what always happens is mom, as a wonderful, gracious host, knows that there's a few people who would be nervous about that and doesn't want to make people nervous. I also don't want to make people needlessly anxious or nervous, but it's hard because I kind of do want to push, I feel like developing that comfort is exciting and energizing and great. And if we specifically did it not just for the Jews there, but even those who aren't Jewish, not just for the people who know the stuff, but the people who don't feel like they know the stuff, that would be incredibly powerful, and it would serve your question, Dana, of what are we trying to achieve? For me, I was taken by that question of what are some of our key goals? And for me, I have 3 goals that I think are implicit goals of the Passover Seder that we don't usually say. And there's certainly goals of the Seders that I have created. 1, connect to people you don't know. I actually love specifically being at Seders where a lot of the people don't know each other. I have never had a nuclear family or even extended family centered Seder. It's just not how my family has ever done it. It's not a bad thing to do, but I think a lot of people's Passover Seders, in the way Miriam described with 75 people, whatever, it's about building our ability to connect to people that are not just our nuclear family. And in a world that privileges supporting your blood relatives and not seeing the rest of the world as part of you, I think that serves us. Second one, embodying and materializing ideas. So taking ideas and putting them in food, putting them in our bodies. The notion that we ourselves left Egypt, that's an embodiment act. And I think that Passover puts us as if we are in the story, and that's what makes it the most celebrated ritual, I think. That's what makes it different from other holidays is we're doing it. We're not just recollecting it. We are doing it. And I think even Seders that see that as oh, it's metaphor, we're not really there, whatever, it's powerful to be in the story. And the last one, and this gets to playing with your food, is inhabiting our inner child. I think that you can't really do even a traditional Passover Seder, but especially the ones that people do contemporarily, without embracing your inner child. You're looking around a house trying to find a hidden piece of matzah. It's a scavenger hunt. You're making symbols of food. You're dipping things in other things. It's all about being tactile. And I think there's a real purpose to remembering that we're not all that. We're not these masterful adults. We're connecting to our inner child. So for me, if I were trying to answer your question, I would try to make goals of let's specifically sort of craft Seders where we connect to people we don't know, number 1, which builds our love for the stranger and diminishes our suspicion of the stranger. And by the way, the takeaway from that might be that there have to be non-Jews at Seders. I think that might be a good takeaway. 2, embodying and materializing ideas and inhabiting our inner child. That would be my goals.
I've tried it a couple of times to have people have assigned parts. One way that I've done it that's worked is to divide up what I want to do. So whether that's the telling of the story or the different components of the Seder, the event itself, and then meeting with them separately, actually spending time on making it clear that whatever someone brings is the right thing to bring and that we're all here for the ride. And maybe in Dan's family, it would be the second night that this would be all on for the ride because it's already Yotze, it's already completed in the way that that group of people needed it. Other people might be this is all I needed anyways, because at home I would have just watched a video and watched The Prince of Egypt and eaten some food and that was good enough for me. And so yeah, bring it on. Let's change it up. You could even just tell one part of the story in 5 different ways and have that be the thing. But I think making sure you know what you're offering and how to support people in that process. And for me, I have a small team that we work on what the Seder is this year, and they love doing it. And it changes sometimes who's there, but it's never just me curating this. It's sort of holding space and making sure there's a beginning and an end, and it all is done within 35 minutes because the kids get hungry and then we have to heat things up and there's different processes. But I think thinking it through in a way you would any other lesson of who your audience is and what you'd like to manifest, and then believing that everyone has shared wisdom at the table or the outdoor space or wherever you're going to be meeting, goes a long way in that process of figuring out what you want to experience and how you would like to be changed. Dan, you had said this line earlier, none of us are living the lives we want to be living. What did you say?
Yeah, none of us is living the life we yearn to be living.
Okay. I think I'm living the life I'm yearning to be living. I'm not living in the world I yearn to live in. And that is where the disconnect happens, that my desire for inclusion and justice and love and my own particular language of Jewish identity is all working. But like the world is kind of a shit show and is definitely a yearn for something different.
I think that a lot of people are kind of, wish that they were doing more to live out some of their values and just don't, because it's easier not to. And you don't have the guidebook in a way to do it effectively. And so, every once in a while you do something good, but you don't feel like you're necessarily living your life every single day that way. So I think for sure a lot of us also feel that the world is not the world that we wish to live in. But I guess one of those questions is, am I doing enough to bring about that world? And, I don't think most people are. And I think most people know that they aren't. So it feels like a way that you could experience something that wakes you up in a way and says, I need to do more. And here's exactly what I need to do. To me, that would be valuable to a lot of people.
I really want to sit with what you said, Miriam. I mean, there's like these and these things happening. I think both Miriam and Dan are right in what you're talking about. Like, I was going to say similar to Miriam did, like, I actually feel pretty comfortable with the life I'm living. I wouldn't say it's like the idealized thing of what I want to be. I'm not full of hubris. It's not like I don't think I could possibly improve. I do think I am more interested in holidays and rituals and practices that are focused on how we, as we are, like each of us as selves, as we are now, could better the world, which is what I sort of hear Miriam saying. Like the world that we live in is not the world we want to see. It's not the ideal world. It's not close. The difference between that world, the ideal one, and what we have is bigger than the difference between our ideal individual self and whatever we are. So like my dream is that holidays would serve that effort of world shifting more than like individual self shifting. But I get how they go hand in hand. Like if each of us were to work on the individual self piece, it would serve that.
And I think that most people, I just think that there's a temptation to blame the world as opposed to blame yourself.
Well, I think that's why I said both of you are right. I think you're right that in our world as we have it, I think this is bad. You might think this is less bad. I think it's bad that we have been taught as an impulse when we see problems to think about how we change who we are individually and not how we in partnership with other people change the way the world is. I see that as a product of our hyper-capitalist mindset where like everything is individualized and it's all about like what one person buys and purchases, what one person does with their body, and less about what the collective system does. But I wouldn't be unexcited. Like I think that there's space for that in ritual and in Passover. And there's also space for like, I don't know, like I had an experience we've done the past couple of years where for the Afikomen, I mentioned there's like, this moment of a scavenger hunt in your house. We do 2 Afikomen hunts the past few years. One, and it was generated, this idea for the second one, in a Judaism Unbound event by somebody, not me. I think his name was Nathan. The first one we do is this word search where everybody's competing and we're trying to win. And there is like a winner or a team, like a small team of winners to find the Afikomen. That's fun. In partnership with this idea from Nathan, we've been doing a collective Afikomen, which is Valerie and I, we take a big piece of poster board and we cut it out into puzzle pieces. And everybody at the Seder has a puzzle piece, and it's hidden in the house. And everybody has to find the puzzle piece, and then we put it together. And there's no winner, but it's just that the project of all of us doing that together, for me, is a meaningful thing. And to me, it's an embodiment of what I'd like Passover to be, which is teaching us to work across, people we do know, people we don't know, different kinds of people, and build something together. So I guess I feel called to like, and I'm not saying, Dan, you're like anti this. I see both of those pieces as important.
Well, yeah, I do want to object to your characterization of my position as, coming from capitalism, only in the sense that I love what you just described. So I don't see what I'm describing as contrary to that. And I will say, I don't want to put a label on it because I'm not sure which label to slap onto it. I don't know which ill of our society is causing this, but I do profoundly believe that there are a lot of people out there that work on these larger systematic changes, these societal changes that are just not doing the internal personal work. And that is why they fail, or that is part of why they fail. And that to imagine that you don't have to do that individual work, I think is just wrong. And I think to sort of say, and I'm not saying, Lex, that you did something, but I say to put that in the realm of that's capitalism, that yes, I agree that it's capitalism if what we mean by that is that it's just focused on this individualistic thing. It's only about me. I totally agree that that's wrong. And so I guess that if there was a way, right, and I'm not saying it's only Passover, this is what I would want from all of Judaism, that it did both of those things, that it helped us improve ourselves as people, and then also helped us make sure that we understand that that's not enough.
I wonder if that's there's this collective thing called Passover, and then there's this 40-day thing that comes afterwards that requires deep internal introspection so that we can have Shavuot, a holiday of receiving some kind of truth. That it takes sometimes a group effort to ignite these things in ourselves and point out where we need to change and how we need to grow. And yet that growth, I think, has to have an awakening, and then it has to have some kind of habit that's associated with it. I'm wondering, with both Lex's beautiful idea with Afikomen and this idea that Dan's bringing up with sort of the particular and the communal and how those things work together to hone against each other, works with the final element of the Passover Seder, which is opening the door and welcoming Elijah or the prophet, and I think we could be saying all kinds of things about who or what that person is in some kind of metaphor. I think for some of us as children, you filled up this glass of wine and, there's always the old uncle who would shake the table and say Elijah came in and drank the wine, and it felt sort of like Santa Claus and also like a weird drunken visitor. It was like a weird thing a little bit. And then we're supposed to cry out, B'Shana Haba Yerushalayim, next year in the land of Jerusalem. That feels like maybe something we need to look at. But I love this idea that we're opening the door to possibility, maybe, or to a world that can be ushered in differently. One, maybe by an individual, but hopefully by a collective welcoming that individual. And I think there's a whole thing there that can be played with, that maybe by the end of the ceremony, we're over metaphors at that point. And so it's just like a dude. But I would love to hear what you all think about what that looks like.
I'm flashing to what Nate DeGroot said in a recent episode about he lived in a fairly spread out suburban or rural situation. And when they opened the door and said, even if you shouted loudly, all who are hungry come and eat, there weren't people who would hear that. And that's a problem. If there's a ritual that was designed, and I think it was actually meant, so you open the door, you welcome Elijah, and I think they also would say to the world, all who are hungry come and eat, that halach ma'anya moment, that bread of affliction moment where you say what the matzah is meant to symbolize, and this idea that we welcome all who are hungry to our Seder. If a ritual was designed in a way where opening your door and saying something publicly would actually reach people, and now it doesn't, we need to rethink that. So Either we need to call people on the phone and there would be an answerer. Maybe people volunteer to be answerers in different for one time zone that's in the evening time when they're likely to be doing Seders. They're doing Seders, but then other people in other time zones, they sign up to be the answerers and they're Elijah. That's one option. But we need to be noticing when rituals don't work. The other thing, L'Shana Haba Yerushalayim, the next year in Jerusalem. I don't think that is a helpful punctuation mark to the Seder. I've used it many, many years, and I've even done the thing of no, we don't mean this is all about us going to Israel. We mean Yerushalayim, which is a word which you can interpret as a world of more wholeness, shalem, wholeness. I've done that. As the last thing, we should have the real estate that is the last thing actually be whatever we want the Seder to boil down to. Even for people who like the idea of going to Jerusalem, I don't think people's thesis statement of the Seder is next year in Jerusalem. So what would be a better concluding note? We need to notice those issues ritually and approach them. And my hope is take steps to align our rituals to really meet what our goals are. So Dan, like the question I'm leaving with for this episode with more than anything is like, you're right. We should have goals. Listener, what's the goal of your Seder? So you might be going to one, you might be hosting. What's your goal as a person experiencing it? So that's step one. Like, what do you want to be changed about you? Is it a grand thing? Do you want to be better situated to intervene in the world in the ways you want to? Do you have a smaller ticket goal? Is it just, I want to know the Exodus story a little better because I have a sense that if I knew it better, I'd be able to use it to channel my aspirations in the world? Is your goal that you just want to play with one step of the Seder that you haven't tried differently? Like, that's equally good. And then you can potluck it with your friends and they each do that for one step.
Yeah, I really love, like, I just want to reinforce what you said, and I know you were reinforcing what Nate DeGroot said, but that so brings it home for me, this idea that if you imagine this original practice, you would be living this incredibly dense city, and you would open up your door and you would say, all who are hungry, come and eat. And people would actually hear you and come. And the notion that we simply enact that in the suburbs where you open your door and you could scream as loud as you want, all who are hungry, come and eat, and nobody would hear you and nobody would come. It's just performative at that point.
Yeah, and even if we're I live in an urban area, like, I don't think we mean it. Like,
yeah, you don't mean it, and if people heard it, they probably wouldn't assume you meant it. So if that whole thing is meaningful, if we're saying, well, what do we mean by that? We mean to say that this is a holiday where we have to love strangers and feed them. Maybe we can't get them to come to our house. We can invite them, of course. We could do that. But maybe what that means is the new ritual for Passover becomes taking our food to a homeless shelter or taking our food to where the immigrants are living who've been bused to our cities from Texas, or whatever it might be. What is this for? Why are we doing it? And this is an exciting direction.
Amazing closing note. And for those of you asking, what is this episode for? In honor of Dan's closing answer, there's a reason we released this a bunch before Passover. Sometimes people have been confused because for a lot of holidays, we release episodes. For our Purim one, we released it like 10 days before Purim. And for Passover, we're releasing it a bunch before Passover. That's because our whole goal is not for us to be the ritual, for us to be like the experience of Purim or the experience of Passover, but rather for us to set the table, pun intended, for you to generate those ideas. And if we did that if you came up with some great idea and it's the second day of Passover, it's harder for you to channel that immediately into your observance. So really, truly take some of these days and see if you have the capacity to help infuse this into a Seder because you're hosting one or you're attending one where you can volunteer. That's amazing. If you have just the capacity to have something happen in your own life over the course of those 7 days or 8, I'm a 7-dayer, some of you are 8-dayers, great, go for it. So please take that opportunity. If you have any ideas on that front, if you have creativity you want to share, all of that, email us. Dan@JudaismUnbound.com, Lex@JudaismUnbound.com, Miriam@JudaismUnbound.com. We would love, love, love to receive those notes. Send me especially your matzah sculptures that you will hopefully do, any matzah calves that you put together, golden or otherwise. I would appreciate those. But with that, this has been Judaism Unbound.